I'm Mark Adams, Education Director at the Truman Library. And the background is rather deceiving. I'm actually at home, but I don't have a beautiful office like that. This is a photograph of the Truman Museum replica of the Oval Office based on photographs taken in 1950. As you can imagine, the library is closed due to COVID-19, but it's also closed due to a museum renovation. And we're hoping to reopen the Truman Library and Museum to the public before the end of this year. This afternoon, I'm going to be talking to you about Potsdam Conference and Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb by looking at some of the primary sources available at the Truman Library and Museum. We have about 16 million documents in our archives collection and just under 35,000 objects, artifacts in our museum collection, and more than 100,000 photographs. I'm just going to do a few items to look at today, primary sources to investigate this topic and look at it a little more carefully. For students who are tuning in, maybe give some ideas and project ideas, and for teachers tuning in, maybe some activity ideas for the forthcoming semester. Of course, it's getting very close to the 75th anniversary of the decision to drop the atomic bomb. And of course, we are literally on the 75th anniversary of the Potsdam Conference that started in mid-July of 1945. So I'm going to share my screen and show you some images, and then we will be using the chat for most of our interaction. I've got a couple of activities that I want you to give feedback on. So if you've not found the chat yet, go ahead and find that, and then that means you'll be ready for when we do a little bit of interaction along the way. And of course, you can use that to ask questions. I'll probably take most of the questions at the end, but if they're relevant to exactly what I'm talking about at that time, of course, I'll try to answer them too and keep my eye on that part of the window. So let me get my slideshow going here so we can begin. And as I mentioned, the two things I'm going to be talking about primarily this afternoon are the Potsdam Conference and the atomic bomb, the decision to drop the atomic bomb. I am the Education Director at the Truman Library, and I've been there about 23 years. I'm looking forward to talking to you more about these two events that happened simultaneously 75 years ago this month. So my first is actually to go back in time a little bit, back to April. Truman had been president since April 12th, as you probably know. FDR had died on April 12th, and 2 weeks later, on April 24th, he receives this letter. And if you look carefully at this letter, you can see who the letter's from. And this is where, if you're a student, you'd need to look at a document very carefully. And we're going to be looking at a number of primary sources, both written, typed, handwritten, photographs, images, and even some newsreel a little bit later on as well. So this is, if you look carefully, can anybody type in the box? Very simple question to begin with. Who is this letter from? It's addressed, Dear Mr. President, but who is the letter from? And you might not be able to read the handwriting of the individual, but you certainly should be able to see the typed title of the individual that was typed on this particular letter on April the 24th, 1945. And so somebody wrote Secretary of War Henry something, and then the next person helps him out, Henry Stinson, although it's not an N, it's actually an M, and it's an I, not an E. So the spelling is tricky, but it's not Harry Stimson, but Henry Stimson. So a tricky one to read, and we realize when we're looking at handwritten pieces of a document, the handwriting can be difficult to read, but it's actually Henry Stimson. And he has a title that we don't see in the cabinet today. He was the Secretary of War. So of course, in April of 1945, World War II was still going on, both in Europe and in Asia. And the previous president, FDR, who had died on April 12th, had installed a separate Secretary of War at that time. Okay. Then there's some writing underneath this we'll get to in a moment, the handwriting. But let's look at the two paragraphs themselves, and I'm going to read them just to reiterate what they have to say. Dear Mr. President, I think it's very important that I should have a talk with you as soon as possible on a highly secret matter. And then he says, I mentioned it to you shortly after you took office, but have not urged it since on account of the pressure you've been under, and there's a typo there, pressure's incorrectly typed. It, however, has made such a bearing in our present foreign relations and has such an important effect upon all my thinking in this field that I think you ought to know about it without any further delay. Faithfully yours. And it's Henry Stimson, Secretary of War. So what do you think that Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, is referring to in that very first paragraph? He wants to talk to him as soon as possible on a highly secret matter. What could that be? And Karen is right on there, so is Will. The Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, that's correct. Great job, everybody. So you've already deduced some information, and this is what we call an inference, where you've inferred some information from the primary source, and you know that he's talking about the development of the atomic bomb. Now, at this point, there had not been a successful test, and you're right, it was called the Manhattan Project, and that's going on in 2 or 3 different locations around the country, and we're going to find more about what's happening, particularly in New Mexico, as we move forward. To finish with this document, and thank you for your responses there, everybody, at the bottom, in Harry Truman's handwriting, it says, and it's hard to read, the cursive, Matt, put on list tomorrow, Wednesday the 25th, HST. So HST, of course, is Harry S. Truman. He refers to a Matt. Well, I can tell you that Matt is his appointments secretary, Matthew Connolly. So he's telling him, put on the list for tomorrow. So he's adding him to his calendar to meet with Henry Stimson the next day, where Henry Stimson goes into detail and tells President Truman all about the Manhattan Project, which means, although he was told very shortly after his inauguration on April 12th in very short form, it takes until April 25th for him to find out all the details from Secretary Stimson. Let's fast forward, though, towards our topic and the Potsdam Conference. So we're dealing with 2 things at once here. We're going to go back and forth, but they do happen all at the same time. So I want you to tell me, we have a photograph here from the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945 in July. What was this Potsdam Conference? What was it about? What do you already know? And then can you identify any of the 3 people in the photograph? So I'll pause for a moment and let you type in there. So anything you know about the Potsdam Conference, and then can you recognize any of the 3 people? And Susan is right on it. Winston Churchill, Harry Truman, and Stalin, and it's in that order. So Winston Churchill is on the left, kind of laughing and has his mouth open. Harry Truman is in the middle, giving the, what I like to call the triple handshake. And then Stalin, Joseph Stalin, is on the right. And then Karen adds, it was a meeting to finalize what's happening with the big 3 as the war in Europe ends. That's right. So we skipped over because we can't cover everything. But that document Truman had looked at in April, in May, on May 8th, we had Germany surrender. And now in July, this is called the Big 3, as a few of you have mentioned. Winston Churchill, Harry Truman, Joseph Stalin meet in Potsdam in Germany to discuss what should happen now that the war in Europe has ended. Of course, the war in Asia is continuing, as we will find out when we talk about the atomic bomb. So let me show you another photo for the Potsdam Conference, and we'll talk more about it. And now we have the same photograph that you've just seen on the left, but a different photograph on the right. So who can explain the differences between these 2 photographs? They're both from the Potsdam Conference. They're both from July of 1945. But what is the difference in these 2 photographs? Any guesses? No Churchill, says Ali. So we don't have Churchill in one of these beautiful wicker chairs. We see Stalin, we see Truman, and Karen, who's on it today, said there was an election in England, and that's right. Midway through the Potsdam Conference, the British hold a general election, and they are sitting down rather than standing, and they have some people behind them, don't they? But Winston Churchill was actually defeated in the British general election, and his replacement is on the left of the photograph. So probably the most difficult question I will ask today is, can anybody name Winston Churchill's replacement, the new Prime Minister? Karen, I can't get by you today. Clement Attlee is right. He's the new Labour Prime Minister who wins that election. And Gavel has the correct answer too. And he comes in. Now, he'd actually been at the conference from the beginning, and so he's not caught unawares. But Stalin apparently was disappointed that Churchill had lost. And then the people behind us, some of the advisors. So Molotov, Stalin's chief advisor, is on the right of the group of four behind the three sitting. And then Secretary of State Burns is second from the right. So we'll move on. Good job spotting some of the differences there. Now, while they are at the conference, events coincide, or events come together in New Mexico, and this sketch is sent to Henry Stimson, who shares it with President Truman. Any guesses, and I think it's fairly obvious, of what this might be? And if you look at the writing on it, it tells you, but it's very small and faint and in cursive. What might this sketch be that President Truman receives while he's in Potsdam? Cloud of the atomic bomb, and I don't have a first name there, but a K shoe. Clouds made by the atomic bomb, says Will, and Gavril, atomic bomb effects, clouds after the bomb. So what has happened? Mushroom cloud, says Hava and David. And then can you read any of the writing underneath where it says cloud drawings? Up on the left, top left. Might be hard to read virtually. Ali also says mushroom cloud. So this is July the 16th, 1945. Will says it's the first atomic bomb. And it does say that, first atomic bomb explosion. And where has this taken place? Do we have any locations indicated on this sketch? The sketch is taken from a B-29 flying at 30,000 feet. And then New Mexico, says Susan, well done. So this is the first atomic test. Thank you, Karen, for spelling all of that out. Alamogordo, New Mexico. And this is the very first atomic bomb explosion. It's the test that takes place in New Mexico. Now, I don't have the full 14-page report for you, but it is available on the Truman Library website on trumanlibrary.gov. It's actually a very easy read. It's all typed, and the Lieutenant General Groves, who writes the report, is very excited and talks about the beauty and of the nature of the clouds that formed and the explosion. And this is a sketch, as you've indicated, from the B-29 flying 15,000 miles away. In fact, they wanted the B-29s to be a little bit closer, but because of the weather, they actually couldn't get too much closer. It's the first time that the word mushroom cloud is used to describe an atomic bomb in that 14-page report. And it's eventually delivered via Henry Stimson to President Truman. So they know the test has been successful. So how is that going to impact things at the Potsdam Conference? Well, as promised for this particular presentation, we're going to look at some of the letters that Harry Truman writes home. There are three people that he writes to the most during this time period. One, of course, is his wife, Bess Wallace Truman, and that's her official portrait painted by Greta Kempton on the right, so you know what she looks like. And the other two people are his mother and his sister. And we're going to look at letters to all of them. But we're going to compare those letters to his own personal diaries and see if we can find any similarities and differences. Now, I will tell you, in our archives, we have more than 1,300 letters from Truman to his wife, Bess Wallace Truman. Some of those from before they're married, and some of those were in retirement. But this letter he writes from the conference, although it's on White House stationery. And most of the letters he writes to his wife are actually handwritten. But I thought this was a little easier for you to see virtually because it's typed. But let me read it anyway, so you have a sense of what he has to say, and in case you can't read it on the screen, wherever you are. So it's dated July the 16th, 1945, the very same day as that first atomic test. And he says, "Dear Bess, we arrived in Berlin yesterday afternoon." So the Potsdam Conference, Potsdam is in the suburbs of Berlin. "We were received with all the honors possible. The Russian, British, and our own ambassadors and ministers met us at the airport. I reviewed the troops drawn up as a guard of honor, and then we were taken to a house in Potsdam." And he moves on. The second paragraph is interesting. He says, "The Prime Minister came to see me this morning. He brought his daughter and Mr. Eden, who is a British government representative, the equivalent of their Secretary of State, Foreign Minister. And he had a very pleasant conference. I'm expecting to see the Marshal from Russia either this afternoon or tomorrow, and then business starts." And then he describes the house. Then he says, "Tell Margaret she still owes me a letter." I'm going to ask you a question about who Margaret is in a moment. And then he gives some instructions. He says, "You send your letters to the White House with instructions. They are forwarded on to me, and I will get them almost as promptly as if you sent them to me in Washington. Lots of love, Harry." And then he has a handwritten note at the end. "Only way I could get this in a pouch." So there's couriers sending pouches back and forth between Potsdam and Washington, D.C. to the White House. So Harvey's already answered. Margaret is his daughter, and they just had one child. And at this point, she's around 21 years of age. She was born in 1924. So he's saying, she owes me a letter too. So let's ask you some questions about this on the next slide. I've left the letter up there. Who created this source? Well, it's pretty obvious who created it, right? So these are standard questions you can ask when you look at any document. I want to focus on the third question because we know President Truman wrote the letter, and we know when it was created. We have the date on there, July 16th, 1945. But where does your eye go first? When you look at this letter, where do you focus? What do you see first when you look at this letter? And then the second part, what do you see that you didn't expect, or what questions does it raise? So a lot of people talk about the handwritten note at the bottom, his signature. So you can ask these questions of any document, any primary source, and these are just to get students and teachers. This is just a way to introduce primary sources to students so they can look at a document more carefully. So most people went to either the first paragraph and then to the handwritten part at the bottom. That makes sense to me. Personally, I went to the White House, Washington, because he's not in the White House, but he's using the stationery. Some people said they went to the underlined part about special duty, as he's making a comment about the previous owner of the building that he's in. Okay. Underlined part, very good. Let's go to our next document, and you can, of course, see lots and lots of questions about this document, but we have a lot to get through. So this is where it gets harder, and this is a handwritten letter. And I will be honest with you, most of the letters that Harry Truman, whether he's president or not, when he writes to Bess, they're mostly handwritten, and the archivists at the Truman Library have done an extraordinary job providing transcripts. So when you look at these online, you can see handwritten. I'm going to come back to this, but I do want to show you, though I do have some transcript of this to look at. So don't worry. Okay? But let's see when this one is written. It's very faint. It's neat handwriting. I don't know if anybody would expect you to say that was neat. Some people say it's neat, some people don't. You do get used to his writing. You did not expect to see the letter in ink. Very good. I'm going to read just parts of it to you, and then we've got a transcript. Berlin, July 31st, 1945. Dear Bess, it was surely good to talk with you this morning at 7 a.m. It's hard to think it's 11 p.m. yesterday where you are. The connection was not so good this morning on account of the storms over the Atlantic. So I'm going to pause there. In that first paragraph, what can you deduce that President Truman and Bess Wallace Truman had done at 7 a.m.? Just type it in there if you know. It says, it was good to talk to you this morning at 7 a.m. How did they do that? He's in Germany. Talked over telegraph, not quite, by a telephone. So they'd actually, this is revealing, right? Because we didn't know this, but they were able to talk over the phone. And in fact, even when Harry Truman was president in Washington, D.C., he would often call to Independence, Missouri, where Bess was, and talk over the phone. And so he's able to talk to her over the phone. Okay, now let's look at the transcript of the section I pulled out to you. Well figured out, everybody. And I just pulled this one part. We've been going great guns the last day or two, and while the conference was at a standstill because of Uncle Joe's indisposition, the able Mr. Burns, Molotov, and Attlee and Bevin all worked and accomplished a great deal. I rather think Mr. Stalin is stalling because he's not so happy over the English elections. He doesn't know it, but I have an ace in the hole and another one showing. So unless he has threes or two per, and you know he is not, we are sitting all right. Now let me pause there because we have a question. Bess didn't live full-time in DC, from Habit and David. That is correct. It's particularly in the summer, she would come back to Independence. She was taking care of her own older mother, who still lived in the home that Harry and Bess lived in. So oftentimes she was back in Independence, particularly in the summer months. Let's look at this transcript. Let's not worry too much about the questions on the right for the moment, but let's pull out a few things. So in the fourth line, he talks about Uncle Joe. Who is Uncle Joe? And just type it in there. Susan is the quickest typer, but then Will comes shortly after. Stalin is correct. So of course, when he's writing to his wife, he's going to use slang, he's going to use nicknames, he's going to use words Bess would understand, but he might use abbreviations, just last names, not first names, things like that. So Uncle Joe is, in Truman's language, Joseph Stalin. Then just to identify a few people, often when you read primary sources, you need to do your secondary research first so you know who the people are. Think of it like a play. Who are the other actors in the room? So Mr. Burns is his Secretary of State. Molotov is the equivalent for the Soviet Union. Molotov was the foreign minister for Joseph Stalin. Attlee and Bevin. Attlee we've already talked about. Clement Attlee was the new prime minister. And Bevin is the equivalent of Burns and Molotov, the equivalent of their foreign minister for the Great Britain, because those are the three countries. He thinks that Stalin is stalling over the elections. Now, my focus is on this last sentence. He doesn't know, he's talking about Stalin. He doesn't know it, but I have an ace in the hole and another one showing. What is he referring to, do you think? I have an ace in the hole and another one showing. And he's talking like he's in a card game. Hava and Karen both say the bomb. And that's my deduction too. Now, we don't know for certain. Often, as I mentioned before, we have to make predictions or inferences. And most historians would agree that President Truman is talking about the atomic bomb. The date on this one let's go back to remind ourselves, is July 31st. So it's a couple of weeks after the first test. So he feels like he's got the atomic bomb. Now, there is a point where he tells Joseph Stalin about the bomb, and we're going to talk about that here in a moment. Will said that's his dad's birthday. My daughter's birthday was July 29th, so very close to that. So it's a good birthday month, Will. So some interesting information there. He doesn't come out and say it, the atomic bomb or Manhattan Project or anything like that, but he kind of makes an inference. Okay, now we're going to see some diary entries to compare those. Often you'll see students and teachers, you're asked to compare primary and secondary sources. What I'm encouraging you to do here is to compare different types of primary sources, because you can get different types of information from them from the same time period. So this one is a Truman diary entry from July the 17th, so the day after the test and the day after he wrote that first letter to Bess. It wasn't the first letter, but the first letter we looked at. I'm going to just focus in on the transcript part here, but you can see his handwriting. I asked him if he had the agenda for the meeting. That's about halfway down the page. And he's talking about Joseph Stalin. He said he had, and that he had some more questions to present. I told him to fire away. He did, and it is dynamite. But I have some dynamite too, which I'm not exploding now. And then the very last sentence at the very bottom of the page, and excuse my language, but I'm just quoting from the primary source. I can deal with Stalin. He is honest, but smart as hell. Now this diary entry, in fact, is the very first time that President Truman meets Joseph Stalin. So that's what the first part of the diary entry is about, where they shake hands and he tells him he's no diplomat, but he'll say yes or no to a question. Very interesting diary entry. But he does make reference to the atomic bomb again, right? I told him to fire away. I have some dynamite too, but I'm not exploding it now. Now we have a couple more diary entries, and then we're going to look at this question. How does the diary entry compare to the letters? So the next one is from the next day. And this is when he meets, first of all, Prime Minister Churchill. And then he talks about Stalin as well in this diary entry. So he says, PM and I ate alone. So PM is Prime Minister. And we know Prime Minister changes, but we also know July 18th, that's still Winston Churchill. Now, here's something very revealing. Discussed Manhattan. It is a success. So we can deduce from this that President Truman, and he says he's alone with Churchill, have discussed the Manhattan Project. Now, in all of his letters to Bess, and later on we'll see letters to his mother and his sister, he makes that oblique reference to an ace in the hole, but he never uses the word Manhattan or anything like that. Then he says, decided to tell Stalin about it. Stalin had told Prime Minister of a telegram from the Japanese emperor asking for peace. Stalin also read his answer to me. It was satisfactory. Then he goes on to say, I believe the Japanese will fold up before Russia comes in. I'm sure they will when Manhattan appears over their homeland. I shall inform Stalin about it at an opportune time. So looking at those two diary entries, how do those diary entries differ than the letters that he wrote to his wife? What differences do you see? Or similarities even? Any differences there in terms of the diary entry compared to the letters? Any ideas at all, just go ahead and type them in there, in the box. Okay, very blunt and to the point in his diary entry. The diary is slightly more formal, definitely more detailed. Diary entries are more revealing. I'm going to applaud. I don't know if you can see me on the video, but you guys are right on it. They're far more revealing. Now, quick follow-up question. Who is going to see his diary entries in the next 6 months? Nobody, says Will, question mark. I think that's right. No one, says Karen. So that might give us a sense of why he's a little more revealing, right? When he's writing to his wife, okay, his wife can see it, but also that letter might be intercepted. It might be seen by other people, right? If he's writing home, has to go through the pouch to Washington, D.C., and then on to Independence, Missouri. Gabriel says this type of writing was quite more urgent in the form of style. You certainly could do a number of exercises looking at the style, looking at the tone, looking at those sentence structures, things like that. So I'm glad you're able to notice some of the differences. Let me show you one more. This is from July 25th. And this is obviously after he's received that whole 14-page report that I mentioned before from Lieutenant General Groves, because the details that he's using in this diary entry on the July 25th use some of the same statistics. And so it says, an experiment in the New Mexico desert was startling, to put it mildly. 13 pounds of the explosive caused a crater 600 deep and 1,200 feet in diameter, knocked over a steel tower, knocked men down. Explosion was visible for more than 200 miles and audible for 40 miles or more. So yes, he's talking about the atomic testing. Then he also says this weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. What does that tell you in that last sentence from July 25th? That last sentence, this weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. What does that tell you? He had a plan in mind. He's planning to drop the bomb. Anything else? You're right. I just want to see if you want to go any further. Would you agree with me that the decision has already been made? Yeah, Gabriel got it as I was saying it. We are great minds think alike there. Yeah, you're agreeing. So it's to be used. So they've already made the decision. And that is on the beginning of the second paragraph, if you wanted to pinpoint the handwriting there, that I didn't make it up. This weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. I've told the Secretary of War, Mr. Stimson, to use it so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target and not women and children. And he goes on. Now, he did tell Joseph Stalin about the existence of the atomic bomb during the Potsdam Conference. So, Will, can you explain your question? He only thought there would be one bomb, though, didn't he? I'm not quite sure I necessarily understand the question. Let me answer your question by giving you some information and see if that helps. By the end of July, Truman knew that the scientists had developed 2 atomic bombs. That's all we had. And one was used on Hiroshima, the other was used on Nagasaki. The piece of information I will give you, most people don't necessarily know this unless they study it very carefully. There was a third, Havert and David, and the third would be ready around, and I've seen August 16th and I've seen August 17th in my research. So somewhere, it's only a day difference, right? So somewhere around the middle of August, 16th or 17th, there should be a third available. But at the end of July, when this diary entry, July 25th, only 2 exist. So hopefully that clarifies your question, Will. And Hannah, Havert and David, thank you for that kind of clarification too about the third, as it allowed me to go a little further into detail. And I can certainly take more questions about that as we go forward. So again, how does this diary entry compared to the letters? Similar answers probably than before, but if you want to restate those or see something different, go ahead and add those in the box now. So how does this particular letter, especially all of this detail, right, about the 13 pounds of explosive, it's very descriptive, right? More detail as to the damage. Here's a lot more information to him, much less guarded. Thank you, Susan. That's a great word. He really goes into detail, but he doesn't put any of that in his letters. Let's take a look at, I think if I've got this queued up correctly, the other people he wrote to were his mother and his sister. Now they're in the farm that Truman worked on as a young man in Grandview, Missouri. And this is photographs of his mother and his sister. His mother is in the center of the photograph on the left, and President Truman is on the right, and his sister, Mary Jane, is on the left. And on the right-hand photo, you just see the two of them and not President Truman. But I thought it'd be helpful to see photographs of them. And then usually when he wrote, he addressed his letters to Mary Jane Truman, that's his sister. I just thought I would put the envelope on here. This is actually from a different letter than the one that's on the right. But I think it's fascinating that he doesn't even put an address. He just puts Miss Mary Jane Truman, Grandview, Missouri, which I think is quite funny because he knows it's going to get there. Everyone knows who Mary Jane Truman is. She's the sister of the president. And then the letter itself on the right side is from July 23rd. And there's a number of letters that he writes to his sister. What's interesting about these is that President Truman borrowed the letters that he wrote to his sister to help write his memoirs. And then after he returned them to his sister, she burned the letters. Well, very luckily, when they were loaned to President Truman to write his memoirs in retirement, the Truman Library was opened by then, and they photocopied the letters before he returned them to his sister, which is why they look a little unusual with the shading, because these are from photocopies. But in this letter, he writes it to Dear Mama and Mary. So Mama is his mother. It's Berlin, July 23rd, 1945. So about a week before that diary entry. And he talks about the letters that he's receiving from them. Your letter of the 16th came yesterday, and of the 7th and 19th came this morning. I'm most happy to hear from you. I suppose the radio keeps you well informed on my movements. The conference has met every day since the 17th. Many things have been accomplished, and many more which should be accomplished have not been acted upon. But we have time yet to get most of them in some sort of shape for a peace conference. Stalin gave his state dinner night before last, and it was a wow. And it goes on, toasted with, or I can't quite read that, something with caviar and vodka and so on. Now what he does in a lot of his letters to both his mother and his sister and to his wife, he describes a lot about the evening events, the fancy dinners, the toasting, the musicians playing the piano. In fact, in one incident, when a musician is playing the piano, they ask somebody to turn the pages of the music. And President Truman stands up and turns the pages of the music, which astounded everybody. But of course, Truman was a very accomplished piano player and could read music very easily. But he doesn't really go into detail about the Manhattan Project, the dropping of the bomb, the decisions being made. He talks far more about the state dinners, the social occasion, and the different people he's meeting. But he does give some impressions of Churchill, of Stalin, things like that. Okay. So now I'm going to show you a video clip of Truman announcing the dropping of the atomic bomb, and then I'll have some questions for you.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware.
Okay, so before I look at this artifact that's on the screen, if I go back, the video will play again, so I won't need to go past that. But could you tell, and I should have prompted you ahead of time, when Truman was making that statement, where was he located? Could you tell that? Susan is so hard to get. She's getting the gold star today. He was on the ship. How could you tell? On a naval vessel, on a ship, say 3 different people. From the window. Wonderful observation, everybody. That's great. In a boat, says Morrigan. The ship window on the left, right. So then, okay, trivia for today. Who knows the name of the ship? Aha, maybe we'll get you this time. Don't Google it. Anybody know the name of the ship? I'm going to give you a crazy clue that's just come off the top of my head. Where did they play the Masters golf tournament? It wasn't the Missouri. Where did they play the Masters golf tournament where they win the green jacket? Georgia, yes, but what's the net? Augusta, right? So it was the USS Augusta. Crazy clue, but there we are. Sometimes that's what you have to do. And that's the ship that he sailed to the conference on. Took him about 2 weeks to get to Europe. And that's what he sailed home on after visiting the British King before he left. So Augusta is the right answer. USS Augusta, where he makes that statement. I don't watch golf. Sorry, Morrigan. I'm a sports junkie, so that was the only clue I could come up with very quickly. So what we have here to finish off is one of the artifacts. We've shown you primary source documents. We've shown you photographs. We've shown you that newsreel there, which is on our Truman Library YouTube page. You can see that whole video, and in fact we have about a 30-minute video of his whole trip on the to the Potsdam Conference via the USS Augusta. But now we have this unusual item in front of you on the screen, and any guesses to what this is? And if you can read cursive, you might be able to read the label attached to it that might give you a clue. Any guesses to what this item is that's in our museum collection? It's not a cap, although that's close. Safety plug, says Raquel. Very good. Something about the Nagasaki bomb, a green safety plug. That is correct. So this is close up of the tag, which will give you more information. And it says, I certify, because I know again it's in cursive, I certify that this is one of the 2 green safety plugs used at Nagasaki. This was the second atomic bomb dropped on the Empire. So what they did was they would take the safety plug out, and then they would put the live plug, which was red, in before they activated the bomb. And then it's signed, and again, the second name is probably a little easier to read. The first is actually Ashworth, is the last name. It's Frederick Ashworth and Philip Barnes. And Philip Barnes, you can all thank for this. Philip Barnes is the gentleman that donated the safety plug to the library in the 1990s. He called up our museum curator and asked him if the library would like this safety plug from Boxcar, which is the name of the plane that was used over Nagasaki. And of course, our curator was only too happy to take it from Mr. Barnes. And that part of the story, I didn't find out until last week. I never knew where we got it from until our curator revealed that information to me. So that's pretty exciting. So you can, that one little plug will be on display when we reopen our museum in the fall of this year. Okay, so just a couple of things for activity ideas. You can analyze a written document like we've done today by looking at any special markings on a document. Is it handwritten or typed? We look at that. You can look at what the main idea was. You can observe its parts, who wrote it, who received it, what is the date. This is available through the National Archives, who runs the Truman Presidential Library and all of the other presidential libraries since Herbert Hoover. And this is available on the docsteach.org website. And you can use this for all different types of sources. There's different sheets for each type of source, like a cartoon analysis sheet, a video analysis sheet, poster, photograph, so on. This is the written document one, which I think is fun. And now I'd like to stop the share and see if we have any questions. There was one gentleman that was on both planes, yes. Oh, I see. There was a guy who was in Hiroshima, then he left to work. Oh, I see. Well, I was misunderstanding. On the flip side, there was, and I forget his name right now, and it'll come back to me as soon as the presentation is over. There was one gentleman that was on both the Enola Gay and the Boxcar on the American side also. Thank you, Will, for that. Any questions or comments? And you can use the chat for any questions. I'm not sure what you mean, who fired the bomb. Do you mean which particular, in the first instance over Hiroshima, it would have been the plane captained by Tibbets over Hiroshima. I think if that's what you mean. More seen as a collective effort, because of course they had gunners on the plane and engineers and so forth. So that would be Paul Tibbets was the man in charge of the first plane. Of course, they were operating under orders from President Truman. At what point in his life does Truman stop making diary entries? Probably after his presidency is over. And he certainly doesn't make diary entries for every day. One interesting fun fact, John, is that in the late 90s, early 2000s, we actually found a diary from 1947, which we'd not seen before. It was actually inside of another book in the Truman Library on the shelves. And one of our staff found the book inside of another book from 1947, the whole diary for the whole year of 1947. Again, not every day. So that was an unusual one. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I forget the exact date. Thank you, Barbara. So we have mostly Truman's writings are his letters. rather than diary entries, but we do have a significant number of diary entries, but we do have more letters, primarily to his wife. And as I mentioned before, some to his sister and his mother and other relatives and other friends too. But the largest collection of letters we have are to his wife from Bess Wallace. The first letter we have to Bess Wallace is from 1910. So they were dating at that point, I guess. They didn't get married until 1919 after he came back from World War I. And then the latest we have is from 1957. And we have more than 1,300 at the library, including the envelopes and things like when he was in France, he would send letters to his cousins and he would press flowers. So we even have the pressed flowers from France in those letters from during World War I as well. Thank you for the thank yous, everybody. And if you've got any other questions, I'll stick around for a few minutes. If not, thank you for tuning in. I know you've got a lot of choices for different webinars and presentations, and I appreciate you tuning in this afternoon. Thank you, Morrigan. Thank you, Will.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark. Appreciate your time today. And thank you everyone for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Therese, as always. I appreciate all your support.
Absolutely. See you soon. Bye.